We are rolling. It is the 6th of October, 2014. It's a Tuesday afternoon, and we're at interview number 2 with David Macarov at his home in Nayot in Jerusalem. David, yesterday we talked a lot about your upbringing and your childhood and young Judea and Masada and growing up as a Jew in Atlanta, your family background, your heritage, being super active in young Judea, later in Masada, going to work as a bookkeeper after high school, your mother's occupation, how she kept, your house was kind of like a boarding house for young Jewish people to be active in the city and not stuck in somewhere in Georgia.
Atlanta.
No, but for other kids to come to.
Oh yeah, come from all over.
From all over, and hold on, there we go. A sec, just a minute. Okay. But just make sure that you and I have eye contact because it's very, very important. Is there anything that we missed yesterday that you feel that we didn't talk about your childhood, about your upbringing? Any story, anything that comes to mind, or anything that you think that we might have missed before we continue?
I did tell you about the Meshulach coming to the door and asking for money.
Yes.
And my mother saying,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
I think we're about ready to go on.
Okay. So I'm going to take you right now to a date that I'm sure you remember where you were, and we're going to start that whole episode of the Second World War. September 1st, 1939.
September?
War in Europe breaks out. Where are you? What are you doing? What's going on with you in Atlanta?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia at that time, in our house on Washington Terrace. I'm still active in young Judea at that point. We have some people living with us that my mother took in, and I was reading in the paper about the atrocities in Europe, which I had been doing for some time, and then Italy entered the picture, and there was a story in the paper about what Italy was doing to the Jews, almost what Hitler did. And as I was reading that, I began to think that these are Jews just like me and my family, and look what's happening. And tears came to my eyes. And one of the girls that lived with us was watching me, and she said, "What are you crying about?" I said, "I'm crying about the Jews of Italy." She said, "You're crazy." Maybe I was, but
why did she say you were crazy?
Because nobody felt that strongly about. They knew what was going on. They were opposed to it, but nobody reached the point where they were crying in the States because of what was happening in Europe.
So were you oversensitive, or were you just understood the big picture?
I'd been very steeped in Judaism, Jewish history, Zionism, and so on, and I knew what was going on, and I felt it very deeply, and that also was part of my moving to Israel.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
But when before World War II breaks out, you hear about what's happening in Germany with the Jews.
Yeah.
Does that also affect you?
We not only heard of it. Henry came to us from Germany after his father was killed on Kristallnacht, and of course that affected us. We kept up with it, but all we could do was keep up in the papers. There wasn't much more to do. There was some demonstrations, but we were youngsters. We might have gone to one or two, I don't remember. There wasn't very much else that we could do, and all that we knew that we could do.
But where are you when World War II breaks out in Europe? What
are
you doing?
I had left the job as a bookkeeper at that firm because the chicanery that was going on there. And I got the job at another firm, whose name, of course, I won't mention. And that's when after the Depression, when the first wage hour laws came into effect. And we were supposed to pay our employees a certain...
You mentioned that yesterday, yes.
Yeah. And
they were scheming it.
The boss told me how I was supposed to handle it, which of course I did. And that was my second experience with American big business. And then one night, I was working late. I was on my way home in the car, and at the corner of North Avenue and Peachtree Street, there was a newspaper boy screaming, Pearl Harbor, war, war, Pearl Harbor. I pulled over and I bought a newspaper. I had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. I had no idea how important it was it was bombed. But I was like most of the people. Almost nobody knew anything about it until they began to understand it more. The next morning when I went to work, my boss had a brother-in-law who owned a radio store across the street. So he took all the employees, he let all of us go across the street, and we heard Roosevelt's famous Day of Infamy speech.
How old are you at this time?
I must have been about 20, I think, at that time, because I'd got, when is it, 40?
41.
41, I was born in 18, so I was 28, 38, 23. And I volunteered for the Army the next day.
Wait a minute.
After Pearl Harbor.
You're in this radio shop.
We heard the Day of Infamy.
Famous Roosevelt newscast.
Day of Infamy, yes, talk.
What's going on inside of you? Now you're not a Jew, you're an American.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I decided I would join the Army, but I couldn't do it immediately because I was supporting my mother, and nobody was joining it immediately. There was a draft, and the draft worked according to numbers, 1, F2, F3, and so on. My cousins began to be called up, my friends began to be called up, and I realized I couldn't stay working in a store like that while the war was going on, so I decided to volunteer. I heard that there was a program called the VOC, the Voluntary Officer Candidate. People who were deferred from the draft, which I was, because they were supporting a parent, which I was, could volunteer for the Army and take 6 months training, 3 months basic training, 3 months officers training. They would, of course, have almost no salary during those 6 months. Their dependent would have to somehow take care of herself, but at the end of 6 months, we would be sent to officer school, and from an officer's pay, we would be able to support our... I spoke to my mother. And,
that day?
Yeah, I spoke to my mother, and she said, as she always did, if that's what you want to do, do it. So a couple of days later, I went to Fort McPherson in Atlanta to volunteer. I signed the papers, and I gave up my job because I was going in the Army. I had very little experience with the Army at that point. I didn't realize that you hurry up and wait. So I hurried up to sign up, then I waited, and I waited, then I waited, and I realized I didn't know when I was actually going to be called up, so I looked for another job.
How long did you wait?
Some weeks. And I looked for another job, and I got a job with a jewelry store that sold jewelry, watches and bracelets and so on credit. And the boss was a very nice man. We had a very nice relationship. But I learned while I was there that they had a collector who went out and collected from the people who had bought things. He was a bulldog. He would go everywhere and he would yell at people. He would embarrass them in front of other people in order to collect the payments on that let's say diamond ring, until the last payment was due. Then he wouldn't show up. Nobody kept a record. Nobody was anxious to pay. They kept, something must happen. He'll come tomorrow or the next day. They didn't pay up within the time, and they took the diamond back and didn't give them back any money for what they had spent so far. Years later, when I told Frida about that, she said, it's illegal. They couldn't do that. And I said, well, they did. And we went to London at one time. We were in the Museum of London, the old days. There was a newspaper clipping on the wall about the last payment scam, that you get them to pay everything, and then they don't pay the last payment, you take it back. It dated back to 1800 something. So I was still working, and I remonstrated with my boss, who was a nice person and had a good relationship with me. He said, now you're learning the first real law of business. Caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Caveat emptor. Latin for let the buyer beware. It's his fault if he didn't read the contract or understand it. And so I saw the same diamond ring go out and go in 3 times, each time at a higher rate. And I was still waiting for to be called into the Army. And after I was, I'll skip just a minute, I'll come back to that. I came back to visit the same jewelry store one day while I was in the Army, and I found big girders, steel girders lying behind the store. And I said to the boss, what are the girders for? He said, we're expanding the store. With everybody going off to the Army, every man wants to leave his wife a wristwatch or wearing something, and every young girl wants to give their boyfriend a watch. Well, the business is booming because of the war. He said, we're going to expand the business. Knowing that iron was in very short supply, I said, where did you get those iron girders from? He said, they're building a new bomber plant in Marietta, Georgia. They need 1,760 girders.
What's
like
girders?
That. Iron girders, heavy iron bars. He said, do they really know whether they need 1,760 or 1,768? And he had 2 bars by. That's why they were behind the store, so nobody would see it. But this is part of the corruption that went on. And again, 3rd time, I was upset by business corruption. And it was very soon after that I was actually called into the American Army.
Okay, so before we get to the Army and you go into boot camp, what's going on with you personally before the Army, between high school and the Army? Are you dating anybody?
Yes. I had a hot love affair with a girl who, we were both relatively young, and when she told me she was going to marry a graduate of Georgia Tech who had become a ceramics engineer, she told me she was going to New York with him.
With who?
With this young man from Georgia Tech. I couldn't figure out, how was she going to New York? Where's she going to live? How are they going to live? I didn't realize what it meant that she was going away with him to New York. And she did marry him, and he was a ceramics engineer. She designed the ceramics, and he made the. Sorry.
Oh Lord.
Sorry about that. What went out this?
Okay, I'm making a note. I'm going to make it in Hebrew. בגלל שהלך לנו התאורה, אז אנחנו אלתרנו פה עוד כמה דברים. מקווה שזה בסדר, זה מה שיש לנו כרגע להיום. ואנחנו נמשיך ברעיון. Okay, so this gal, how long did you guys date?
How long? We went together for some months. We broke up, we came together. Her brother-in-law was a dentist, and from the window of his office you could see the outside of my office. So sometimes she would be there and see me going to work. Sometimes I would be there and I'd look up to see if she was in the her brother-in-law's office. And whenever we broke up and decided not to see each other anymore, one of us would call the other and say something like, did you read that new book by so-and-so? Or did you get an invitation to such a dance? And we'd be off and running again. That went on until I went into the Army. And
now, and you're still active in Masada, you're still active in Young Judea as a leader.
What happened was that all the draftees began to be called into service. My cousins were called in, friends of mine was called in, and I began to feel very useless.
Okay.
I wanted to fight Hitler, and there I was, they were all going in, and I was waiting for the call that I had volunteered for. And it finally came. I was asked to come out to Fort McPherson, and then I started basic training.
Okay, wait a minute, before that, just so that I get it right.
Yeah.
Why did you volunteer for the United States Army after Pearl Harbor? What was it that said, I'm going to drop everything right now and I'm going into the Army? What was it?
Because it was clear the United States was going to fight Germany too. And Hitler was my personal enemy for what he had done to the Jews. And I knew about it through Young Judea, through other things. And so the Army, realizing that I was going to kill Hitler if I could get hold of him, sent me to the Far East. So it wouldn't be.
We'll definitely get to that. We'll get to that. So your mother has no problem with you going into the Army?
My mother said, if that's what you want to do, do it. That was all my life, she told me that.
Before we get to the Army, can you describe your relationship with your mother to me? What kind of relationship was it?
Oh, we doted on each other. That's about all I can say. That she thought I was great, and I knew she was great. And
you guys had a good relationship?
We had a good relationship, yes, all the time.
Now, one more question before. Yes?
Well, in the house that we had, which was our boarding house, so to speak, we had boys, young men, who were not married. And Mama decided that she was going to be a shotgun. She was going to be a matchmaker for the girls who were in the house. And we were really interested in girls, but not interested seriously in girls. So every now and then she would invite a couple of girls over for the afternoon, and then she'd come back to the back room where Henry and I were playing cards, and she'd say, there are a couple of girls who are coming, I'd like you to come out and meet them. And after that happened once or twice, we realized we were being manipulated to meet these girls, she would come back to the back room, and as soon as we heard the doorbell ring, she would come back to the back room, and the screen door would be open and we'd be gone.
Why?
Well, because we didn't want to be manipulated into meeting those girls. We would pick our own girls. We didn't want to pick the girls that our mothers thought for us. So that was part of the relationship. It was a kind of a joking relationship. We laughed about
definitely
it.
An inspiration to you, a mother, somebody that you could talk to.
Oh, but not only that, the fact that she took all these people in. She treated them all like her children. She took care of their morals. She put them on the straight path. Not only that, she knew all their dietary needs of all the people in the house. This one didn't eat chicken, and that one needed stuff boiled, and this one didn't like.
Was the house kosher?
Yeah, yeah, and she knew all. She was that kind of a person, and well, the fact that she has a reputation to this day, his Aunt Fanny, in Atlanta, says a lot about that.
Tell me, I have one more question to ask you before we get to the Army.
Yeah.
When you're between the age of 18 or even 15 until you go into the Army, in the world of Zionism, who is your mentor? Who's your leader? Who's your...
Our Young Judea Club leader first And then the president of Atlanta Young Judea, who was an accountant and my Sunday school teacher, and to whom I also looked up to for this kind of thing. So.
And as far as like world Zionism, like I don't know, like Nordau or these people. Or
We know some names, but
we didn't really know.
yeah, so most of the Young Judean clubs were named the Nordaus or the Zolians.
You were the Herzlites.
I was the Herzlite, yeah.
Okay, so now we are going to go and step into this fascinating period of your life, of the world, which is World War II. Do you remember the date?
I found my whole growing up fascinating. The date?
Do you remember the date that you were actually, actually went into the army?
I think it was in March of, must have been 40, no, the war started in the fall of 42, didn't it?
No, the war started on December 8th, 1941.
41, or so. I went into the army probably the end of 41.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where do you go?
Well, as I say, I went to Fort McPherson.
Where's that?
And it's outside of Atlanta. And took all kinds of tests. I was very pleased to find that I was the fastest typist they'd ever had in Fort McPherson. My mother was very pleased because it was reported to her that I had a very high intelligence quota, so we were both very pleased. And from Fort McPherson, we were sent to Keesler Field in Biloxi, Mississippi. Keesler Field were some wooden huts on a wide expanse of sand in the Gulf of Mexico. We lived in tents, and we were a group called the Volunteer Officers, the VOC, so we were a separate group, kept ourselves. And we had to train more severely than other people, under greater discipline than other people, because we were supposed to be training to be officers. And the first day we got to Keesler Field, we got to our tents, a private first class, obviously an immigrant from Europe. He had a terrible accent, and he was not really a very bright person. He was supposed to show us how to make hospital corners on the beds. So he took a cot out into the middle of the tents, and he was going to show us how you make the hospital, which is a certain tight, which all armies do that. And he said, now, I'm Frida lent it. Frida got it. He said, I'm going to show you how to make hospital corners on these beds.
What's a hospital corner?
You lift it up and you place it a certain way. You turn it this way and you turn it that way.
The bed?
Yeah, the sheet.
The sheets, okay.
The sheet on the bed, yeah. So he took the sheet, he put it on the bed, he started on one corner, then he thought about it, and he dropped it, and he went to another corner. Finally, he began to search his body, and he said, I've got a diaphragm here somewhere. When he said diaphragm, of course, we all burst out laughing. And he looked around, because he was already a private first class. We were just draftees. Who was laughing at him? Nobody. Everybody had the straightest face. But you know, that would have made a wonderful spy story, a diaphragm with all the news on it. Nobody would have caught on to that. Anyway, we learned how to make hospital beds. We learned how to drill. We drilled, of course, extensively.
Drill?
Drill with arms.
Maneuvers.
Maneuvers.
Yeah.
Well, not only maneuvers, but right face, left face, about face, forward, and so on. You know, I was very surprised. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed being part of a group that was all doing the same thing at the same time. It made you part of something. And when he said present arms, boom, everybody's arms came up. And it was like a ballet, and you were part of the ballet.
Do you, it's what I want to ask you is, it's 1942 right now. Do you know what's going on with the Jews in Europe?
Of course.
You know about the concentration camps?
As the news began to come out, I knew it like everybody else. Yeah, sure we knew it. That's why I was hoping to go to Europe to fight Hitler.
So you're in basic training, you're in Mississippi.
Yeah.
You're probably the only Jew there. This must have been a very...
There were probably other Jews there. I remember one soldier who didn't like something, and he was going to complain to the captain, and he went to the door, and I thought he was Jewish, but I wasn't sure. So when he got to the door, I said, "Soll gar nicht helfen. It won't help you." I said, "Soll gar nicht helfen." And he turned around and said, "Das weiß ich." That I know that. I said, "It's not going to help you." And he said, "I know that." But we both spoke Yiddish. We both spoke Yiddish. So we knew that the others were Jews. One day in the mess hall, they served big hunks of what looked like corned beef. And I took my corned beef to my plate, and I cut it, and I smelled it, and I realized it wasn't corned beef, it was ham. And as I walked out, I threw it into the trash. And an officer was standing there. They were trying to cut down on wastage now. And he called me over and he says, "How come you're wasting food like that?" I said, "Because it's ham." He said, "What's the matter with ham?" I said, "I'm Jewish." He said, "Oh." That was the end of the incident. I think that was the first incident of the Jewishness.
Did you have any, well, I'm sure this is also a time for you where you're actually seeing a lot of people from around the country, a lot of...
Well, no, they were all off in the South. Fort McPherson was outside of Atlanta. Everybody was from around the South.
Around the same place.
Yeah.
Did you run into, at this point, okay, so I'll get to that question later. So you're in boot camp in Mississippi.
Yeah.
3 months.
3 months,
and
yeah.
And then you go to?
Every morning on the bulletin board, there would be orders as to where people went. And soldiers would go up to the bulletin board and say, "Oh shit, they're going to Omaha, Nebraska, or Twin Forks, South Dakota." And other guys would go there and say, "Boy, oh boy, they're going to Los Angeles or to Miami," or wherever the Army was sending them. Well, I was sent to Rantoul, Illinois. And I had no idea where Rantoul, Illinois was. Nobody else did either.
Can you say the name again?
Rantoul, R-A-N-T-O-U-L, Rantoul, Illinois. I didn't know where it was, nobody else knew where it was. I looked on the map, all I could see was there was a branch of the University of Illinois there. Actually, it was not far from Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, which was a big city. And I was in Biloxi. We had got our reassignment. We had nothing much to do except to wait for the date. So a friend and I went to the beach in Biloxi.
Biloxi, Illinois?
Biloxi, Mississippi.
Still in Mississippi?
Yeah, before we got there.
So you're on the beach in
We went to the
Mississippi?
beach, wearing bathing suits, and put on bathing suits. And while we were talking, a young lady, a very shapely young lady, came over, and she began to sort of talk to us, and she was asking us questions. And after a while, we understood that she was trying to find out if we were officers or not. If we were officers, she was going to be with us. If we were not, she was going to leave us. So she finally decided that we didn't want to pretend to be officers because that was a criminal offense. And so we finally fed her around all kinds of stories, and she finally got disgusted and started to walk away. When she got about 20 feet away, I said to my friend, "Let her go, Major. She's not interested in us." She spun around on a dime and came back to talk to us, thinking he was a major. But we were glad nothing happened, because it turned out she was the daughter of the commandant of the fort. And yeah, so we were lucky.
What was it like for you to, like, you're in a uniform now, you're in the U.S. Army.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
How are you, what does it do to you?
Well, I can mostly tell you stories rather than one day there was an announcement that there would be a leave for soldiers from Saturday afternoon to Sunday night. The only condition was you had to wear a first-class uniform. Mm-hmm. That meant the khaki-pressed uniform, not the sloppy stuff we were wearing. There was a mad rush to the tailor's office, who was Jewish, and everybody was lined up, and first ones came out very pleased with their clothes would be ready before Saturday night, and then they began to come out despondent. They weren't so sure they'd be closed, and then they came out saying, "That bastard Jew, he won't do my clothes on time." Now, I had made friends with a man who called himself JB. I don't really know what his name was. JB. He was not Jewish. He was from Boston, and he was obviously officer material. He was tall. He was broad-shouldered. He had a Bostonian look in his eye, and he had been a lawyer. And as we stood there in line, and he watched these guys disappearing, he said, "Oh, the poor guys, they just don't know how to argue a case. Wait till I get in there." So he went in, and I was right behind him. I stood in the door and listened.
Arguing with the tailor?
Yeah, the tailor was measuring him, and he said, "My sister's brother-in-law is a general at this base, and he's invited me to dinner Saturday night. So I would appreciate my uniform being prepared before Saturday night." Taylor looked at him and said, "Maybe Sunday." He said, "You don't understand. If I don't show up, the general will want to know why, and I'll have to tell him that the tailor didn't get my clothes done well." He said, "Well, maybe not Monday, maybe Tuesday." He said, "Look, we're both men of the world. We understand each other. You get my clothes ready on time, and I'll take care of you." He said, "Not before Wednesday." And he came out, that Jew bastard, and I went in, and the tailor was seething with indignation, and without thinking, he said, "Goddamn Yankee," because he had come from Boston by his accent. And then when I spoke, he realized I was from the South, and he began measuring me, and then he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Atlanta." "What'd you do in Atlanta?" "I worked in such and such a store." "Did you know my sister, Eva Goldwasser?" I said, "Of course. She was the assistant bookkeeper." He thought I was pulling his leg. He said, "What did she look like?" She was older, straight hair, dark glasses, very quiet. He said, "My God, you really did know her. You'll come to my house for dinner Saturday night." And so on the spot, he did my uniform beautifully. I walked into the barracks. JB was lying there smoldering. I thought he was going to say, "You'll hear from my lawyer." He's lying there smoldering, reading a paperback, and I walked in with my uniform done. He said, "What the hell?" I said, "JB, you just have to know how to argue a case." And I became friends with the tailor and his wife.
What was his name?
Goldwasser.
Goldwasser?
Yeah, the tailor's name.
Yeah, was he older than you guys? Was he like?
Oh yeah,
he was like a professional.
Oh yeah, He was a tailor for the army.
For the army.
Yeah, he
was like a
didn't
contractor.
even live on the base.
Yeah.
He lived with his wife off the base,
Yeah.
and we went there.
Your typical Jewish tailor.
Yeah, and he. I visited him a few times after that, and he took me fishing once. I've never been fishing, never particularly liked fish, but he was pulling stuff out of the ugliest things you ever saw. Didn't look like fish, round things with bumps on them and so on. And he was throwing them into separate containers. And I asked him why. He said, these are kosher. They've got fins and scales. These are not kosher. These I give to the officers. These I keep for myself. So he also had a dog. He told me his dog's name was Caliph. And I thought of Caliph as the Arabic word, C-A-L-I-P-H, the Caliph of an Arab officer of some sort. So I just smiled and said yes. It wasn't until I got older and learned Hebrew that I realized he was using the Hebrew word for Caliph. He called his dog in Hebrew, Caliph.
So
well,
we're still in Mississippi.
The day we were on the beach in Mississippi, and we were shipping out the next day. We were on the beach, remember, the sun was shining and we'd been in the water, and we got on a train that afternoon, and I went to Rantoul, Illinois. I stepped off into a blizzard. Snow 18 inches deep, the wind blowing like I'm in my summer uniform. It was such a shock to my system. I have never liked snow or ice skating or anything having to do with cold weather. I can't stand winter. I love summer.
That must have been, and that's probably the first time you're ever in the north.
It's the first time I was in the north, yes.
And you walk into a Chicago blizzard, an Illinois blizzard.
Yeah, and in September too, that's when I couldn't believe it. We got to our bunks and the heating hadn't started yet. We piled everything on top of our beds that we could.
What's going on in this base in Chicago? Tell me. Why did they put you there?
In Rantoul?
Yeah, why?
They decided I was going to be a weather observer. And that's where the Weather Observer School was. So I started Weather Observer School. And it wasn't difficult, but it was very detailed. In those days, there were 27 different kinds of clouds. There was the low level, the middle level, and the upper level clouds. Each of them had 9 different features. There were cumulus and nimbocumulus and altostrata and strata, and so we had to learn all 27, so we could look at the clouds and know what clouds they were. Oddly enough, if I jumped far, far ahead, much later in life, there were only 9 kinds of clouds. 3 upper, 3 middle, and 3 down. How could nature change like that? Well, of course, nature didn't change. The Army manual changed. And instead of having to know 27 kinds, it was good enough to know 9 kinds. But I had to know 27 kinds.
You were in at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So the Army is telling you that you're going to be a weather observer.
Observer, yeah.
How do you take that?
Well, I learned that I had come very close to becoming not telegram, I forgot what the instrument was that they sent mail things on. But I'd almost become a technician. Now, I don't have golden fingers, I've got butter fingers. And I had never done anything mechanical in my life. And when I saw how close I had gotten to be a technician, I was delighted to be but incidentally, the way I became a technician was interesting. I heard that there was a chance that I was being assigned to the teletype, to the teletype maintenance school. frightened the hell out of me because I didn't know anything about teletype, electricity, mechanical stuff. I was not a workman. And a friend of mine, who had also been assigned to teletype school, said, "You want to get out of it?" I said, "Oh, very much." He said, "Leave it to me." I said, "Okay." He comes back a couple of days later and he says, "You're going to go be a weather observer." I said, "How did you arrange that? Nobody can change the Army's mind. How did you?" He said, "I went to the school. I met the head of the school. I told him how pleased I was to be able to become a teletype technician and that I was sure I would do a good job. But I had one worry, that I knew a guy named Macarov who had also been assigned to that school, and he was the greatest fuck up in the Army. He messed up everybody. He got in everybody's way. He ran away whenever he can. He would ruin the reputation of the school." So the guy grabbed a piece of paper and wrote something on it, and I no longer was in line for... So I said to this guy, "How did you know to do something like that?" He said, "Easy. I was a high school principal." So...
So are you meeting interesting people in the Army so far?
Well, these people that just measuring in passing, nobody
yeah,
that
I understand.
Yeah.
Because you're switching. So you're now in Illinois. You're in
Rantoul, Illinois.
Rantoul, Illinois, and you're going through weather observatory school. How long is it?
3 months.
3 months. Are you going to become an officer after or before, or?
It should have been after, but when the interview came up, I had nothing great on my schedule. I'd been an ordinary soldier. I'd done nothing great. My past, I'd been an office manager. They even asked me what sport I played. I'd never been a sport. I'd played some golf, so I said I'm a golfer. They said, "Who won the Augusta Open last year?" I didn't even know the Augusta Open had taken place last year. So they saw a little Jewish boy that was not going to be an Army officer. And so,
what happens after you finish the weather observatory?
Well, then I was sent to a place called Big Spring, Texas. It ain't big, there is no spring, but it was a town called Big Spring, Texas. And I was delighted. After all that snow in Illinois, on the train down to Texas, I could just smell the flowers, and I was delighted to be in Texas. But when I got to Texas, I found that my duffel bag with all my clothing had not arrived. And I ran into the sergeant's office and I said, "Sergeant, my clothes haven't arrived. I've got nothing, no clothes to wear, nothing. Send a wire, find my clothes." He was from somewhere up north. He said, "Soldier, you're in the South now. We don't do things fast. We do things at our own pace." This is a guy from Illinois, I think, telling me that we don't do things fast in the South. So I had to buy a new toothbrush and a few this stuff later showed up. It seems that instead of being sent to Big Spring, Texas, it was sent to Bighorn, Texas or something of that sort. So then I became a weather observer. We would fill balloons with gas. They're weighted properly. We would send them up, and with what's called a theodolite, we would look through it and keep track of it and note where it was at each 15-second interval, which is how they knew the speed and the direction of the cloud. And then that information we had to put into code and send it off on the teletype so it would all come together at some point and they'd get a big... This is before synoptic screens and so on. And
so you're doing this in Texas?
Yeah.
Training?
Yeah. And it was dull. The Big Spring is nothing, but I had a piece of luck. As I went through town, I saw a department store with a Jewish name on it. Something like Jacobs, though it wasn't Jacobs. And as soon as I could get a leave from the base, I went into Jacobs department store and I met the owner. Like the German immigration we talked about before, he had come as a peddler, had gotten some out of Texas, started a store, now it's a department store. He invited me over for dinner. I was one of the few Jewish men that had showed up. I maybe not as there. And I met his daughter. We were almost the same age. She was a nice girl, a plain girl.
What does that mean, a plain girl?
Not pretty, not vivacious. She was a girl.
Average?
Beg pardon?
Average?
Average, yeah.
Yeah.
But she had she was very lonely. She was a typical Jewish girl, only Jewish girl in a small local town. So we soon began to go out with each other, go out. She had the use of her father's long black car that she drove. And she would drive out to the base and pick me up. And we would go for a ride. Sometimes we played tennis at the local tennis club with the rackets from her father's store. And there was never any romantic feeling between us. No, we didn't share memories or dreams. It was just very convenient for her to have somebody finally to go out with. And it was certainly convenient for me to have somebody who would take me out of the base every now and then. And of course we had dinner in her mother's home from time to time. And you would not believe how many people were envious of me and how they were envious of me. She would drive up in that big black car and I would walk over, get in. The guys would whistle and stamp their feet and they wanted me to introduce them to that girl day and night. People asking for an introduction. It was
Were there no women on the base? Were there no women on the base?
No. And so it was, if there had been, there'd probably been officers. Anyway, it added a great deal to my stay there.
Do you remember her name?
No. And I don't know what happened to her. I wish her well. I hope she did well. But for us, both of us, it was just an interlude of...
It was a friendship.
A friendship, yeah. But boy, when she drove up that big car on the base, everybody wanted invitations. Everybody wondered, how could this little Jewish boy have this girl drive up that big car and pick him up? So I gloried in that, I must tell you. But the stay in Big Spring, Texas, was quite uneventful.
What happens after Big Spring, Texas?
I finally got my shipping orders to ORTC in North Carolina. I had no idea what ORTC was.
What does that mean, ORTC?
Overseas Replacement Training Center. I was being trained to go overseas and take the place of somebody else. When my mother heard that, she said, maybe you could talk to the general, maybe we could get some influence, maybe we... And
we would get you out?
And I kept saying, oh, no. I was excited about going overseas. I'd never been overseas. You say, oh, I'd be going overseas somewhere. And after a while, I realized what my mother and I were differing. I was so excited about going overseas, and she was so fearful of my going overseas that I immediately changed my opinion and said, well, I'm sorry, I have to go. It isn't something I want to do. And so we were in North Carolina just for 6 weeks or so, training how to jump off a ship if it's going down and swim with your clothes on, things like that. And then they sent me to Santa Ana, California to ship out.
That's okay. Wait, maybe Peter will get it.
She's not sleeping, she will. Yeah.
Wait, so when you're in North Carolina.
I'm in Texas.
No, you're in Texas and in North Carolina.
Now I'm in North Carolina.
Did they tell you where they're like Santa Ana's in California? So apparently you're going to the Far East. But did you hope to go to Europe?
Sure, I wanted to fight Hitler.
So when did they tell you? When did you find out that you're not going to?
They didn't tell me. There's a war on soldier, don't you know? That's all that the ads
They
always
shipped you out
was.
to Santa Ana.
Huh?
Santa Ana.
Santa Ana, California, which was the port there. And there we went there to embark. And of course, as usual, hurry up and wait. We were there for a while. And while we were there, special forces in those days didn't mean fighters. It meant morale builders, singers and dancers and so on.
USO.
Well, USO was for the soldiers. These were people that came. Anyway, it's not important. So they would come out, and sometimes they were Hollywood stars, and sometimes they were noted singers. And one time, I went to a performance which was a comic, a Jewish comedian, a comedian. And he came on the stage, he looked around at all the soldiers, then he smiled and he turned to a general with medals on him and he said, "Hello, Boychik." Nobody laughed. He looked around, he tried it again, he said, "Boychik, how you doing?" Nobody. Then I looked around and they were all black soldiers. They had no idea what Boychik meant. He went through his routine, which was from the Catskills, Jewish allusions, Jewish jokes, things about New York and so on. The audience began to drift away from him, had no idea what it, and he just didn't know. He couldn't change, he couldn't adapt. That was his
Do you remember the name of this comedian?
No, he was some small timer, he wasn't big.
So you're in Santa Ana. How long are you there for?
Just a few weeks, not much.
Anything significant happen there?
No. No.
Where do you get shipped off to?
Well, we boarded the ship. Where are we going? There's this war-owned soldier, don't you know? Nobody will tell you anything.
You don't know where you're going?
No, of course not. We got on the ship, and as I walked up the gangplank, holding my big duffel bag with everything that I owned, I said to myself, you know, this is all I am. This duffel bag is all I am. That's all I have. My whole treasure, my whole life, everything is in this duffel bag, because nothing else exists for me now except the uniform and the helmet and the canteen and so on. So we got onto the ship, and
how did that make you feel?
Like hell. And we got onto the ship, and we all got down to the bunk. We were in 4 high bunks. There was always a question whether you'd like to be on the bottom bunks, you could get out early, but then you get stepped on by 3 people getting into the upper bunks. Do you want to get into the upper bunk? Well, you got to step on 3 people going out of the... I had an upper bunk. It was dark. I had a flashlight and I was doing some reading while I was there. And eventually we took off. Nobody knew where we were going.
Are you with a platoon? Or
Beg pardon?
You're in the Army, right? What corps? Like, we're in the Army. What division?
I was in the Air Corps. Air
I
Corps.
didn't know that.
Yeah, but it just happens a weather observer, and as a weather observer, I was assigned to the Air Force. But who else needs weather observers?
There was no Air Force at the time. It was the Air Corps.
Air
It was
Corps.
part of the Army.
Yeah, but who else needs weather observers except
The Air Corps.
Except the Air Corps, yeah. So we got on the ship, and we started sailing south I could tell we were going south. And somebody put on the bulletin board a map that showed where the ship was going. 2 days later, that thing was ripped off the bulletin board. We might tell somebody where we're going. How are we going to tell them? I don't know, with radios in our teeth or something? We're going to tell the enemy where we're going. But anyway, we had no idea where we were going. They told us when we crossed the equator. And two things on the ship remain in my memory. One was the smell. The hold was full of potatoes because we were going to be away for weeks and weeks. And potatoes are about the only thing. And rotten potatoes have a smell that goes through everything. So for weeks we had the smell of the rotten potatoes. We also didn't have any chewy food, nothing crisp. Everything was steamed or boiled, and soft bread, nothing crispy at all. Our idea of heaven was to eat a potato chip, but there was, and in addition to the terrible smell throughout the ship, there were a company of armorers, those who repaired armor in the army. They all had their little toolkits, and in each toolkit there was what's called a ball-peen hammer. A ball-peen hammer has a round end on one side. They had picked up coins in Santa Ana, and they were making rings out of the coins. So how do you make a ring out of a coin? They would find a hard surface, stand the coin on end, and begin to tap. Tap, tap, tap as they turned it around. Tap, 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 till the end began to spread out a little bit, a little bit. They kept that up for weeks until the thing would be spread out enough. Then they cut the center out of it, and you had a ring which on the inside of it said E pluribus unum or something of that sort. But the constant tapping, day and night, there was no order against it. You couldn't stop them, and they had nothing else to do.
It drove you absolutely nuts.
Mm-hmm.
It drove you nuts. It drove you crazy.
It drove us crazy. That and the smell of the potatoes. We sailed for 3 weeks without seeing land or another ship. Just 3 weeks of sailing through the ocean with nothing to do and nothing to read, no exercise, no nothing, just being on the ship for 3 weeks. And then suddenly one morning we woke up to find ourselves in a harbor. We didn't know where we were. And some of the guys asked around and they told us we were in Tasmania. Tasmania? We ever heard of Tasmania? Boy, native girls and ukuleles, and, boy, that must be great. As he pulled into the harbor, we passed a big warehouse, and on it said Hobart, Tasmania. So we were in the town of Hobart, and on the island of Tasmania. They arranged that we should have not exactly a parade, but a walk. We'd been on the sea so long, three real walks.
How long was the journey?
3 weeks down to Hobart. And then we marched through the city of Hobart. The people there, Hobart was their major export is apples. So they would throw apples to the soldiers and we would catch them as we marched. Some of them threw Australian coins. It's part of Australia. Some of them threw Australian coins to us. As we passed one corner, I saw a man standing there holding his son by the hand. Something looked vaguely familiar. I've never been in Tasmania. I realized he and the boy were wearing kippot. and he had a velvet bag under his arm. And I realized it was Rosh Hashanah. I had lost all sense of time. It was Rosh Hashanah. And I so much wanted to shout Shana Tova to him. Oh, they wouldn't let me. We just went walking on. We got back on the ship, went to Fremantle, and then we started up north. And then there was an announcement that anyone who wanted to learn Chinese, there would be Chinese lessons. Chinese? We're going to China! This was everybody. Boy, that was, no one had ever been to China, even thought about going to China. So they each group was supposed to send one person to study Chinese. And again, I already had reputation as an intellectual, so my officer sent me, to the great chagrin of another guy who had studied languages in college and felt he should have gone, which he should have. But they sent me to the Chinese course, and we began to learn a little Chinese. We learned how to say, how do you do, and how are you, and not good, and how's the weather. We learned that Chinese is a very difficult language because they use 4 tones. A straight tone, an upward going tone, or downward going tone, and a sort of chattery tone. And those tones can make the difference between the word dog and heaven. It sounds the same, but the tone makes the difference. So it was very difficult. And after about 5 lessons, they stopped. No more lessons. Either the officer got tired of teaching, or he felt we weren't learning anything, or...
And this is on the boat?
It's on the ship, yeah.
On the ship,
yeah.
Excuse me.
And so what happened to the Chinese lessons? There's a war-on soldier, don't you know? The only answer you ever got. So we went up north on the ship, another 3 weeks. It was 6 weeks altogether. And we began to hear music over the ship's radio, which we had been hearing American songs from records and so on. We began to hear this high keening sound on the radio, and the announcer says, guys, you better get used to this. This is the Indian method of music. And we realized we were going to India, yeah.
I want to stop you for a second, and I want to go back to Tasmania.
To where?
To Tasmania.
Yeah.
And that story that you told me about getting off the boat, marching down, and seeing the guy with the son. Because there were some tears in your eyes right now when you mentioned that. And I want to ask you, were those tears of joy, or were those tears of sadness, or was it tears of missing home? Was it tears of being in touch again with your identity?
The tears were now, not then.
I know, but that's what I'm asking
Now,
about.
yes. As I look back on it, I realize how meaningful it was. At the time, it was just nice to see a Jew on the street. And I was sorry I couldn't yell Shana Tova to him, to let him know there were Jews in the troop marching.
In the American Air Corps.
Yeah.
So, 6 weeks from Santa Ana to India.
To Bombay.
To Bombay.
We came into the Bombay harbor, and there were a lot of little boats around, and they were all shouting, boxes, boxes, boxes. We didn't know why there was a shortage of boxes in India, but people started talking match boxes and food boxes and they would pick them up and put them in the boat, and we couldn't understand that. And then representatives of the Chamber of Commerce and the American Embassy came on board to give us a briefing about how we should behave. The cows are sacred, you don't hurt them or make touch with them. The people are our allies, you don't try to hurt them. But most of all, you do not eat the food. You will go to an army base, and that's where you eat your food, because anyone who gets amoebic dysentery will be sent back to the States immediately. in hospital, and his army time will be lengthened for the time that he spent getting back to the States and in the hospital. So don't eat the food. We'd been 6 weeks without anything crunchy, without anything our teeth could bite into. Boiled potatoes, boiled eggs, soup, boiled meat. We couldn't, two friends and I, we couldn't wait to get to a restaurant. And as soon as we got off the ship, we went to a Chinese restaurant where we just gorged ourselves on the Chinese food. And actually we were three friends. One friend refused to go. He was a straight hour. He said, the Army says eat in the Army mess. That's what I'm going to do. So myself and the two friends went out and ate everywhere we could, anything we could. And he went only to the Army mess. He got a big dysentery.
At the mess hall?
Mess hall. And had to be sent back to the States and serve his bad time. And we were enjoying the food. So we were in Bombay, in a tent camp there. And then we were put onto a train. Again, we didn't know where the hell we were, where we were going, or anything. And we realized the train was going north, past all kinds of little villages. The train would stop every now and then for no reason that we could tell. When it stopped in town, there were hawkers selling food. And we learned to say, chawala, chawala, tea-man, tea-man. And he would come and pour tea in our tin cups, and we'd drink the tea. We finally got to Karachi, which in those days was part of India. It's now Pakistan.
Sure.
We got to Karachi, and we went to the camp, and a couple of days later we had some leave, we could go to town, so we went to Karachi. Nothing great, nothing terrible.
Probably the first time you've ever seen Muslims in your life.
Seen what?
Muslims.
It didn't make a terribly impression. In those days, Muslims were just another religion. There was nothing bad about them. I'd seen Catholics, I'd seen... but I did find there was a Jewish club in Karachi.
That had to do
No, I'm sorry, it wasn't a Jewish club. It was a club for servicemen in Karachi.
US
And I went in the club and I met a young man there, and it turned out he was Jewish. No, the club was not.
Okay.
It turned out that he was Jewish. Incidentally, one of the things about the club, it had the kind of chairs that had arms that would go out like that, so you could put your feet over the chair to keep cool. Also, it had a line of fan, sort of wickerware fan in the ceiling, which had a rope going into the next room. In the next room, there was a little boy pulling the rope, letting it go, pulling the rope and letting it go to create some air. He was called the Kuchawala. And I met this young man, and he turned out to be Jewish. He took me home to their little one-room apartment.
And he was a soldier?
No. You know, he was civilian. I think he might have worked in the club.
Was he a local?
Yeah.
He was a local Pakistani Jew?
Yeah. And he took me to his home. I met his mother, they lived in a small place. And he said that he had thought about going to Palestine, but there was no anti-Semitism in India. I'm sorry, he said there was anti-Semitism in India, and he thought if he went to Palestine there'd be no anti-Semitism. But there was no color bar or color distinction in India. He was afraid in Palestine, as his dark skin, he'd be discriminated against. I told him that I'd never been there. I didn't know. I couldn't give a definitive answer. But I had new friends who had been there. So I wrote to somebody who wrote back and said that there was very little color discrimination. There were very, very little colored people here at that time. So he said that he was going to go on Aliyah. I know I'm skipping forward, but 8 years later in the States, somehow a letter of his came to me. He said he was still thinking of Aliyah, and he had some questions. So I answered his questions. We got to Israel. The state was established. We knew somebody who worked in the president's office. And she told me that they'd been getting a flurry of letters from some men in India who wanted to come on Aliyah, wanted them to pay for it. And if I needed references, they should use my name. He would use my name. I figured that's the young man that I met in Karachi. The hell do I know about him? But he was insistent. And he finally came on Aliyah. I think it was 32 years later, which means you should never give up on an old lad. And then he pestered the president through his secretary for weeks. He said for all he had done from Aliyah, they should find him a good job. All he had done was talk to me. So I was in Karachi, and one day in the camp I realized that it was Friday, and I found out there were, am I right?
Yeah.
I found out there would be a Friday night service. So I went to the service, very few soldiers there, but a few, and the chaplain was there, the Jewish chaplain of the army was there. So I helped him set up the table, the chairs, set out the prayer books, and get the wine ready and so on. And I came back the next Friday. We were there for 6 weeks. I came back the next Friday. I did the same thing. And it became a habit for me. Every Friday night I would help out. So the rabbi said to me, how would you like to become a chaplain's assistant? I'm meeting with the general tonight, having dinner with the general tonight. If I ask him to change your assignment from weather observer to chaplain's assistant, I'm sure he'll do it. Thought about it. And I realized I'd put in a lot of effort learning to be a weather observer. And I realized as a chaplain's assistant, I'd be doing nothing at all to help the war or fight Hitler. In addition to which, I would be bored spitless. There was nothing to do. I had no duties except Friday night to set up. And Karachi was not a city that attracted me very much.
So, you didn't see your future there?
No. So I told him no, that I would wait for my orders, shipping. And I got the orders from the army. And I was being sent to the Naga Hills of Assam, India. The Naga Hills of Assam, India. I went to Rabbi Dubin and I said, I'm being sent to the Naga Hills in Assam, India. He was still very annoyed that I wasn't staying on. He said, what do you expect me to be sent to London? I said, well, I wouldn't have minded that. So we got on the train, and again, long trip.
Now, where is this?
I'm in Karachi.
You're in Karachi, but you're going to these mountains. Are they east, west?
On the
border
east, border with China.
Border with China, okay.
Yeah. So we get on this long train ride through India. These trains were low priority and no amenities at all. But we did make a stop in Delhi. And outside of Delhi is the city of Agra. Agra is where the Taj Mahal is. So one night, a group of 3 or 4 soldiers and I, we hired a gharry, a horse-drawn vehicle, and we drove us to the Taj Mahal in Agra. It was a full moon night. The full moon came up behind the Taj Mahal for our first look at it. Something I'll never forget. Gorgeous building and the full moon in the background. That made a real impression on me. Anyway, From Agra, we went on to Calcutta. That's when I got my first taste of real human degradation. People sleeping on the streets, defecating off the sidewalks, washing themselves, if they washed, in the fire hydrants. Just the lowest kind of, and again, my feeling about what we were building in Palestine was something which I was proud of.
Well, what's being built, well, what are your feelings about what's going on in Palestine now? You know that,
No,
I want to talk about that right now for a second because you're
No, we knew very little of anything. We didn't know what's going on in the world at all. We didn't have newspapers.
Yeah.
We didn't have radio.
You're cut off.
But I'm remembering what my idealization of Palestine was, that this kind of human degradation would never take place there.
Okay. Now I understand.
So we came to Calcutta. From Calcutta, we went up country. Problem?
No, I'm writing something down. Yeah.
We went up country to the Naga Hills of Assam. A long train ride. Then we were on a small boat. We, the soldiers, were in the upper deck, and the Indians who were cooking their food and had their goats and so on the lower deck. But an unfortunate thing happened. There was only one bathroom upstairs on the upper deck, and we all got diarrhea. And the rush to the bathroom and the stink in the bathroom, and there's nothing you could do about it. You were on the boat, and nobody to appeal to. It was a terrible, terrible trip. We finally came to a place called Dibrugarh on the Brahmaputra River. We debarked there, took a train to a place called Tinsukia, which was the beginning of the new Lido Road. The Burma Road had become unusable. They were building a new road which started at Lido, and we went to an army camp called Dinjan, D-I-N-J-A-N. This was an Air Force camp on the tea plantations of Dinjan. And we lived in tents until they built a barracks for us. And there I became a weather observer. There the planes had to fly, and I had to be on duty and off duty.
So this is actually the first time since you went into the Army that you're actually doing
something positive.
Something
Yeah.
for the war effort.
That's right. And it was sort of a passive thing, but nevertheless the planes had to fly. They weren't flying over Hitler, but they were flying over Japan. And so we had 4 on and 8 off every day. The only thing, well, a few things I remember from there, but one of the things I remember is I went to the town of Tinsukia, which was the railhead, on a leave one day. There were thousands of black troops all over.
Black.
We were building there, and the engineers, black troops were all engineers.
Black who?
Black. Negroes. They were all
American
black
soldiers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. They all were in their own units, and they were almost all builders of some sort. And I went to this little town. There was one Red Cross building, one Red Cross restaurant that served coffee and donuts. There were hundreds and hundreds of soldiers milling around the street. They had nothing to do and nowhere to go. And I heard one black soldier say to another, "Look at them. Just look at them. They ain't got nothing to do and they ain't got nowhere to go. And they wouldn't have nothing to do if they had somewhere to go. They just as poor and as miserable as they're ever going to be in their lives. And you know what? They ain't going to be off that ship 2 hours before they talk about the good times we had in India." damn fools. This was my introduction to a sociological concept called memory screen. You screen out the bad things and you remember the good things unless they're traumatic. Anyway, I learned about that later in the university. So I lived in Dinjan as a weather observer. One day, Lord Louis Mountbatten showed up.
Who?
Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Can you explain to me who that is?
He was a famous British general. He later became the viceroy to India. He was the Duke of Edinburgh, and he was in the Navy. He showed up in his sparkling white uniform with the decorations, and he stood on a box while we were all around him, and he said, "Fellas, we've been told that there are some little Japs running around these woods. They can live for 2 weeks on the rice they carry in their pockets. They're trying to hurt us. If you see any of them, do me a favor, will you? Kill them." And we thought that was hilarious. So I fell in love with Louis Mountbatten. I later had other relations with him too. But we were there in Dinjan.
So the base that you're in right now is basically an Air Force base.
Air Force Base, yes.
And these planes that are taking off and landing, are they fighter?
They're flying what's called over the hump. The hump being the Himalaya mountains. They're flying into China with supplies and munitions and so on. And they're also looking for Jap soldiers. And one day, while I was in the weather station, the siren sounded, which meant danger. We all went out and jumped into the slit trench. Our lieutenant sat on the edge of the trench looking around. He looked up. He said, oh, I see two Japanese planes are coming here. They're right on the right way here. In fact, they're right over here. They're dropping bump. What the hell am I doing here? And he dived into the slit trench, and our base was bombed by the Japanese.
Tell me about that experience.
Well, I was in the split trench, but the pilots had been training for weeks and weeks how to take off two at a time, wing to wing. And the first pair that went off, I guess in the excitement, touched each other, and they both crumbled and caught fire. So none of the other planes could get up.
So they bombed the
Dinjan.
The airstrip.
Yeah, and I must say that it gave us some prestige in Assam because we were the only group who had been bombed by it. So anyway.
Was anybody hurt?
No, just the pilots were. After a while, our captain called us all in, and he said, "We need a volunteer to go into the Burmese jungle in order to send out weather information from an airstrip there. Any volunteers?" I was the only one to raise his hand. I was bored spit. I'd been doing the same thing day after day, no entertainment, nothing at all. Any change was a good change. So he looked at me, this small, bespectacled intellectual who would be more at home in a yeshiva than in a Burmese jungle. And he said, "Why, Mac? Why you?" And I told him, "Sir, I'm just bored. Any change would make a good change for me." So sure enough, they flew me into an airstrip. We had finally gotten away from the Japanese in the middle of Burma, called Myitkyina. It's spelled very differently, but it's called Myitkyina. And I came down to Myitkyina. The captain, who was so surprised that I volunteered, he had thought he'd get a tall, bold, who the hell cares, jungle fighter. He got a little yeshiva student. And when I came there to find the guy I was replacing, he was a big, tall, bold jungle fighter. We lived in a hole in the ground, deep hole in the ground, like this, and 2 places for beds like that, with a tent over the top. We hung our helmets upside down outside the tent every night because it rained every night. That's how we got water. The Japanese mortared the airfield every day.
Every day.
Every day. And the Chinese and Burmese civilians whom we hired would go out during the day and fill in the holes. Day after day. I was doing my duty, watching the clouds, sending in the weather reports and so on. And one day, a group came in over the mountain, a group called Merrill's Marauders. Their captain was a man named Merrill, and they had been a famous guerrilla team in Burma for some time, taking down Japanese installations and so on.
Commandos.
Yeah, they were beat. They were absolutely dead when they came in over. And they came to Dinjan to recuperate a bit before they went out again. The next group that came in over the hill was not beat up, new people coming in to Dinjan. And
I'm gonna just stop for a sec.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Right. Another group of soldiers came in, and I went over just to see where they were, and one man evidently thought I was Jewish or reckoned it. He turned to me and he said, "Oy vey, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing here. I was studying engineering in CCNY 2 weeks ago, and here I am, and I got this thing in my hand they call a rifle. I don't even know how to use it." The Army had something called the ASTP, the Army Specialized Training Program. They were training experts whom they would need sometime in the future. But as the war wore on and became more and more difficult, they decided they needed boots on the ground more than they needed future. So all of these academicians who'd been studying all kinds of studies were put into the infantry and sent overseas with very little training. This guy was about to cry. So I went over to him and I said, "Look, it's all right. We're all here together. The American Army is much bigger than the Japanese Army. It'll work out." He wasn't convinced. And damn it, that same night there was an order to go out and man the perimeter. We had built dirt barricades around there. We had to go man the barricades because there was fear of a Japanese attack that night. He was in the group that I was in. I've heard about people having their knees shattered. I never saw anybody whose knee, he couldn't control his knees. He was so scared. We're going to all get killed. There's nowhere to hide. They're big. They're going to kill us. So what am I doing here? Why am I not back in New York? I went over to him. I put my arm around his shoulder, and I said, "Look, the American Army is strong. The Japanese Army is far away. We're going to get through this all right. Just hang on. You'll be back in CCYN before you know it." And the Japs did attack that night, and they were repulsed, not by us, but by the whole group that was there. And then they took that group out for further training. I never saw him again. I hope he became a great engineer.
So you actually saw combat?
Oh yeah, I was bombed in Dinjan and mortared every night. Were
you injured? Were you injured?
No, but one night my helmet was hanging in front of the tent and a mortar shell landed there, and it just shattered the helmet. And I held on to that. It was my souvenir of who I'd been. You would be surprised how many stupid people said to me, "Were you wearing it?" If I'd been wearing it, I wouldn't have had a head.
At this time,
I took it home when the war was over. We all had to turn in our equipment, and I refused to turn this in. I said, "I fought for this, and I'm going to keep it." And some officer said to the sergeant in charge, "Let him keep it." So I took it home. My mother felt it was much too weaponly, too dangerous, too reminding of too bad things. She threw it out.
What rank are you in the Army right now?
I was a corporal when I went into the jungle. I was in the jungle for about a month, and when I came out, my officer said to me, "What would you like as reward, Mac?" I was the only one that volunteered.
Why do they call you Mac? Because Macarov?
Yeah, Mac, yeah.
That was your nickname, Mac?
Yeah, to him it was.
Yeah.
He said, "You want a promotion? You want a medal? What do you want?" I said, "Well, I'd like a promotion." So he said, "All right, I'll make you a sergeant." And I said,
a corporal?
I'd been a corporal, yeah.
To a sergeant?
Yeah. And then he said, "Anything else you'd like?" I said, "Yeah, I'd like to get to a big city. I'm sick and tired and bored to death here." He said, "Okay, I'll see what I can do." And soon afterwards, I got orders transferring me to Calcutta. You bored yet?
No, I'm good. I see we have another 20 minutes on this tape.
Yeah.
Let's finish that 20 minutes and we'll call it a day.
Okay.
So you're in Calcutta?
Well, I came down in Calcutta, and I came down to a place called Dum Dum. People know what a Dum Dum bullet is. A Dum Dum bullet is a bullet that had a cross cut in its head, so it'll open up inside whatever it hits. And those Dum Dum bullets were invented in this village. The village was there before the airfield, but the airfield is now called the Dum Dum airfield. I came down the airfield. I met a Jewish boy who invited me to spend the first night in his tent with him. He was a Brooklyn boy, 150%. The very caricature of a Brooklyn boy. He actually said oysters. They hadn't eaten oysters in a long time. He spoke of living on Toity-Toyd Street.
Toity-Toyd?
Toity-Toyd. Toity-Toyd Street. I had never
Stereotype, classic stereotype Brooklyn.
Huh?
Classic stereotype Brooklyn.
Classic stereotype Brooklyn. He had never read a book in his life except comic books. He hadn't finished school. And he was the first Jew that I met. He was Jewish. He was a truck driver, the classical Brooklyn truck driver. And so I spent the night in his tent. Then I was assigned to Barrackpore, which is 18 miles outside of Calcutta. It had been a golf course for the British forces. And because they considered my work of all the observers as intellectual strain, we had a very easy schedule. We were 8 on and 16 off.
Nice.
Yeah, which is very unusual. You know, it was supposed to be, we were so tight in the code room that we were working in. So I found out there was a shuttle to Calcutta, the army truck. Every night would go into Calcutta and then at a certain time bring soldiers back. So I went into Calcutta and I realized it was Friday. So I inquired about a synagogue, and I was told where there was a synagogue. I went to the synagogue and I found a few other GIs there with the services. And when the services was over, the chazan came to me and 2 other guys and asked us if we'd come home to dinner with him for Friday night. We said, look, you know, we were strangers, we don't want to impose and so on. He said, no, I would like you to come. And we said, we don't know how. He said, I'll show you how. So finally we reached a compromise. We would go in a rickshaw with him. He would show us where he lived. And any time we wanted to visit, we would come there. So we got to his house, and out of his door came three beautiful girls. And we said, who are they? He said, my daughters. We said, we'll have dinner. And we went up, and we had dinner, and toward the end of the evening, officers began to come in. Now,
what kind of officers?
American officers.
Into his house?
Yeah.
Why?
American officers, and so invited did not fraternize. If officers were there, we shouldn't be there in a social gathering with them. And we knew it, and they knew it. And as we got ready to go, the father came over and says, why are you going?
The Chazan.
Yeah. He came over and he said, why are you going? We said, well, they're officers. He said, well, my daughters work for them. That's the only thing. They're not here as officers. They're here to see my daughters. That made us run even further. And so anyway, through him, he invited us to a concert in the Jewish girls' school. At the end of the year or something, they were giving a concert, so he gave us all tickets. We went to the girls' concert. There's a Indian girl sitting next to me, and we began to talk. Her name was Rivka.
Did you even know there were Indian Jews?
No.
That must have been...
Yeah. Well, I thought when we went to synagogue there'd be all the soldiers, but there were Indians there. I began to talk to her, and I said, you're Jewish? She said, of course. I said, you're Indian? She said, of course. I looked puzzled. She said, look, my family traces themselves 9 generations back in India. Does that make me an Indian or not? I said, I guess it does. So she invited me to come to the Beit Mishutaf. They had a Chalutz group there that was planning to come to Palestine.
Chalutz.
A Chalutz group planning to come to Palestine.
Calcutta.
In Calcutta.
Please continue.
And so I went to the they had one were going on to form a kibbutz, so they were all living together already in a kibbutz style.
And this is this girl Rivka. She takes you. Rivka.
Yeah,
she takes you there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
There were young men and young women there all talking about going, and they were delighted to see me because I had some Zionist background. I knew something about organizing and programs and so on. So I fit right into the group, and I practically began to live in Calcutta. I would visit Barrackpore for my job, but then I would visit Barrackpore, where the army was, and do my job, and then come right back to Calcutta. As I was practically a Calcutta Jew working in Barrackpore instead of a Barrackpore.
So what were you doing with them, with this group? Were they, what movement were they from? They were from Chalutz?
Chabonim.
Habonim.
Yeah, I don't know how they got to be Habonim, but they considered themselves Habonim. And of course, there were a lot of soldiers who visited them and were around them. who were Jewish soldiers, yeah. And I got very close to the group.
How many were there?
There were about 20, I think,
nice.
yeah. And they had a hard time. They were planning themselves for kibbutz life. They'd never done any hard work in their life. They knew some Hebrew. They taught themselves Hebrew.
I'm sure they also mostly came from like upper middle class backgrounds.
Yeah, well, I learned that there were 3 groups of Jews in Calcutta. One of them were the Cochin Jews whose I don't know the word I want, who say that their ancestors came on Solomon ships and were shipwrecked on the coast. And they stayed in India and grew, and they became coconut sellers. They were called Saturday coconut sellers, something, because they observed Shabbat. They didn't work on Saturday. This is one group, and these were dark-skinned Jews who wore Indian clothing, and they were the Bnei Yisrael, or the Cochin Jews. The second group were the people who had come centuries before from Iran, that is Persia, and so on. These were the Persian groups, the Sassoons and others. And they made up the major group there. And then there was a third group of the refugees who had managed to get there from Germany and other countries. So there were these
very
three.
Recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were.
But they weren't Indian. They were just living there.
Well, they'd been living there some time now. But anyway, these were the three groups, and I wouldn't say there was any apartheid between them.
How did it feel for you to all of a sudden, in Calcutta, to be thrown back into a position that you did in Atlanta?
I loved it.
I mean, that's
on the contrary, I was very excited about it. I was very excited to be able to help that group, that they also wanted to go to Palestine as I wanted to go to Palestine.
At this point, okay, that's another question that I have to ask you. At this point, do you want to go to Palestine? Do you want to become an immigrant? Is it already boiling inside of you? Have you made up your mind? You haven't made up your mind yet.
No, I hadn't.
No, but
Yeah.
What kind of influence did this Habonim group in Calcutta have on you? If you think about it today.
I was very impressed with them.
Why?
Because it was a group of people who had nothing to do with Palestine, who decided they wanted to go there to live, some of them were giving up. There was one young man who was quite wealthy, and he realized that in a kibbutz he would be, so he got an industrial job. He worked in a factory to learn how it felt like to be a worker. And I must leap ahead for a moment, because when the war was over, I got a telegram from him, and his capitalist background came through. He said, "The war is over and the share market has fallen. The stock market has fallen." He couldn't resist putting. Anyway, to get back to the group, I spent a great deal of time with them.
How long do you think of a time you spent with them? Was it weeks or months?
Months. Once they gave a party, and they knew
they became kind of like a family in a way.
Oh yes.
And this is the first time you were exposed to Indian Jewry. This is you're seeing a whole different side of Zionism, globally.
Yeah. Well, the Zionist part of Zionism is Zion. People who want to go to Palestine,
sure.
people want to go to Palestine.
It's different than from in Atlanta.
Yeah. So, by the way, once they gave a party, and they heard that I could buy Coca-Cola at the PX. So they asked me
What's the PX?
The Post Exchange. It's the Army store. So they asked if I could bring them some Coca-Colas, and I brought several bottles. They were very disappointed. They said they had heard about Coca-Cola all their lives, but there were no Coca-Colas in India. And now they finally brought them Coca-Colas. It was nothing but colored soda water, which is basically what it is.
A lot of sugar and caramel, and right? A lot of sugar and caramel.
Yeah.
Correct. So tell me, when you're with this Habonim, and I'm sorry that I'm getting back to it, but I think it's
all right.
Probably one of the most fascinating things that we've talked about today and about your story is running into this Habonim group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was about a few months that you were with them. You were like just being kind of like an advisor, a friend to them.
Yeah. I was not. I had no particular position, not even
Sure.
not
You were
even
external.
informally.
You were
I was
external.
I was practically a part of the group, but I was a foreigner.
Were you dating anybody in this group?
Dating, they didn't date.
They didn't date.
Indeed. I'll tell you a story about that later.
Okay.
They didn't date.
They didn't date.
No.
They had to be within very...
Yeah.
So what year is it right now when you're in Calcutta working with this Habonim? Is it 1943 already? 44?
The war ended in 45. It must have been 44.
44. So the war is already like
Oh, yeah.
progressing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This is after Stalingrad,
I don't remember that.
D-Day,
No, not D-Day. It
Do
was
you remember
before D-Day.
before D-Day.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
before D-Day.
Before
okay?
Franklin Roosevelt died.
Before
before
Roosevelt
D-Day, yeah.
died, of course.
Yeah.
Before Roosevelt died.
Yeah.
Is there anything more, because I want to try and end soon with the military and with the army, and I'm trying to get to that, but we're coming towards the end of the war. You've been in the army, it's already 2 years? You haven't seen your
Yeah.
mother?
I'd been in the army for 3 years, 1 year in the States and 2 years in
Abroad.
India, yeah.
And was there anything else significant that happened to you while you were overseas, as far as combat, as far as Jewish experiences?
Let me a number of things happened.
Okay.
I was sitting in Terracini's tea shop. Now I'm an omnivorous reader. I've been an omnivorous reader ever since I was born. I've read anything I put my hands on. While I'm putting on my shoes, while I was putting on my socks, I was always reading. And the problem that I had in Calcutta was to pass the time away. I had time when I got back to town. So there was a bookstore called the Oxford Bookstore, which sold English books. And I would go in there to buy books. And I discovered what are called the, I don't know if it's random, the giant books, something called the giant books, which are very heavy, thick books. And I would buy the giant books because it gave me more to read. And it didn't matter to me what I'm reading very much, I was reading. So I was sitting in a tea store one day reading Jean Christophe by Anatole France. And a man came in and he looked at me and he said, "You're a Jewish soldier, you're a soldier, aren't you?" I said, "Of course."
Well, are you wearing a uniform?
"Yeah, of course." He said, "Where are you from?" And we began talking like we do. And it turned out that I was Jewish. He said he couldn't believe it. Later, he told me the first Jew the Calcutta community met was Jaime, the truck driver from Brooklyn. And they thought that that's what American Jews were like. When he sees me reading Jean Christophe in a bookstore, he couldn't believe that I was also an American Jew. So that made an impression on him, made an impression on me too. But I can say, in the course of being there, are we in a rush for time?
No, we're good.
In the course of being there, they also had a Judean club. And the Judean club had...
The army or in Calcutta?
No, Calcutta
Calcutta
Jury.
Jewish
Calcutta Jury had a Judean club, and they had programs and parties and debates and so on. And I was there once. I used to go from time to time, and there was a discussion of Zionism going on, for or against and so on. And there was a man sitting in the corner, sort of smiling at the whole thing. And I got to know him later, and his name was Harold Goldstone. You with me?
Yes, I am.
Harold Goldstone. Years later, when we came to this kibbutz, and I'm really skipping, we met a neighbor named Tzvi Evenpaz. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and we both said, Calcutta, Goldstone, Evenpaz. Exact translation. So that's...
You met him in Calcutta?
Yeah.
And he was in the U.S. Army?
At the Judean club.
He was in the U.S. Army?
No, he was in the British Army.
He was in the British Army?
Yeah.
He was a British Jew.
Yeah. So in the course of being in Calcutta, I met a young man called Charlie Solomon. And Charlie invited me to his house for dinner one night. And I went to the house for dinner. It was an upstairs apartment with a back doorway and a big apartment. And I went up and I found it was beautifully furnished. And on the shelf was a vase, the prettiest vase I'd ever seen. And you know, you come into a new house like that, you need something to talk about. Hello is not enough. So after we said hello, I said, that's a gorgeous vase. I've never seen anything like it. His mother, Mother Solomon, said, you like it? I said, oh, it's gorgeous. We sat down to have dinner, and being in the army, I took normal portions, and I filled myself up. And then the bearer, the waiter, comes over behind me and tries to put more food on my plate. And I said, no, I've had enough. So Mother Solomon says, no, you must eat more. And she starts to put food. So I have to hold her wrists to keep her from putting more food on my plate. I said, you're just like my mother. When the evening was over and I left, the bearer handed me a wrapped package. I said, what's this? They said, it's the vase you enjoyed, you appreciated. I remember hearing something about if you praise somebody in somebody's house, they give it to you. And she was giving me that vase. I said, Mother Solomon, I can't take that back to the army. It would be stolen by tomorrow morning. I've got no place to keep it. She said, but you admire it? You must have it. I said, look, I'll make a deal with you. You keep it here till I leave Calcutta, and then I'll take it with me. By the time I left Calcutta, I'd forgotten all about it. But anyway, that was... And in the course of the evening, I met her daughter. Her daughter was 17 years old. She was in Hebe, H-E-B-E. And I thought it stood for the Greek bearer of the gods, the cupbearer of the gods. His name is Hebe. She's a gorgeous girl. And the Solomons were very, very hospitable to me. They had me over all the time, and anytime I could, one or two, I could just drop in. And one day, I realized that there was a movie playing at the local movie theater. I've forgotten the name of it now, but I've got to remember it.
That's actually okay, because what we're going to do right now is we're going to stop for today, and we're stopping at the Solomon's family.
Yeah.
We're going to continue
All right.
there.
Good. Okay.
Hold on.